And it's Ken Kraetzer for Sons of the American Legion Radio. We're going to do a special edition report, talk to one of our friends from New Rochelle about the impact of the Russian ship that was sunk by apparently Ukraine launched missiles. And we're very pleased to speak with Lieutenant Commander retired Brett Morash of the United States Navy, PhD, the Executive Director of Racing for Heroes, and also a fellow colleague, show host at WVOX in New Rochelle. Brett, how are you tonight?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Ken.
Pleasure. Just stunning news that the Russian flagship of their Baltic fleet was hit by apparently two Neptune missiles, 60 or so miles out at sea. And the missiles incapacitated the ship. The crew was removed, and apparently while it was being towed, it sunk. And what a loss that is. What's your thought on what happened with this?
Well, as you know, I mean, it's really only about 48 hours since this kind of happened. So I think a lot of information is still kind of coming out. And so, sort of my initial, reaction, of course, as a career U.S. Navy surface warfare officer is that you tend to kind of look at these things from like the lens that I lived in. And, sort of see even some of the more recent historical things that have occurred, and, how this could have happened. And although the Moskova was not a relatively new ship, she did have modern combat weapon systems on board. And I think we had talked before the show that, steel is cheap. And it's really electronics and things like that are where the money really is, or the people side of things. So, if you look at kind of, and I don't know where you want to start, Ken, because I think there's a lot of things, there's a lot of pieces of this, everything from like the way the Ukrainian Navy was able to get missiles downrange accurately is, in my opinion, like really hard to do that. Like that's not a simple task because there's other things that go ahead.
How do you think they launched these missiles? I mean, were these just from a unit on the shore, or was it naval base? What do you think? Where do you think these missiles were launched from?
So I'm fairly confident, based on what I've read in sort of just my basic research, that it fired off of what's known as a TEL, a TEL. It's an acronym that stands for Transporter Erector Launcher. Typically, those things come with other vans that are associated with them. That might be like a radar van, a command and control van, and then they're sort of like in like the World War II, World War I-esque American way, where we have like the forts that are down in New York City with like the old coastal guns. Think of this as kind of the modern equivalent of that, except it's mobile. You drive it to wherever you can put it on your beach to protect your shores. And the weapon system that the Neptune missiles are a Ukrainian product, but it has a certain lineage back to the Soviet era, SSN-19, I think the shipwreck missiles, which is pretty neat. I mean, they're, so like you're talking about technology that they understood how to use. Is it as clever as like a Western weapon system? Probably not, but the stuff works. And, it's big warheads, big radars, big weapon systems. And so for them to do that, you have to imagine that, the earth is curved, right? I mean, if you think about what's 60 miles away, it's like New Haven, right? From New Rochelle is like a good kind of like rough rule of thumb. I think anyone who's been on the coastline here knows that on a nice clear day, you can kind of see Stamford, which is kind of like on the halfway distance, right? So, if you imagine in a radar horizon sort of way, New Haven's pretty darn far. And I think the easiest way for everyone to remember it is like WVOX's antenna transmits about 40 miles based on its height, right? Yeah. And power out. So, it's sort of the same kind of like thing where it's really kind of power out and range. But, this ship, from what I've seen, was about 60 miles at sea. And the weather itself was, I think, fairly marginal. So you're talking about, sea state with like 6-foot waves, high winds, the same weather that the Russian Navy is now claiming led to it being led to the ship foundering while it was under tow. So what that means though, from the Ukrainian launching side, is that not only do they have to have reasonably good targeting of like where in the pond that ship is, with like some basic figure of merit of like what, where they think it might be. So it's sort of like a area of uncertainty, let's say, like statistics point of view. So I don't know. I don't want to get out ahead of you, Ken.
Is this a smart weapon that would have been able to look for the ship and change course to where the ship might have been based on its own radar internally?
Yeah, so the weapon systems usually, this weapon system was probably set up in such a way that it was told to go down a certain bearing line. So, maybe on the shore side, like they had like a radar, this thing called electronic sensory measures. But basically, like, imagine like you using your AM radio, and anyone who's had like an old transistor set knows that like you kind of had to move the antenna a little bit to kind of get that signal strength just right. Or if you had the one on your roof as a kid, you had to kind of tweak that antenna.
Yeah.
So they basically think of it in the same sort of way, as that, the military radar on the Salve class cruiser has a very specific frequency. So if on the beach, they're using that same like UHF antenna like you had in your roof as a kid, kind of getting a basic bearing line, then shoot the missile down that line. And then, they maybe they did, maybe they didn't know how far down. So, they can sit here and say like, okay, turn the radar and the missile on at 10 miles, 20 miles, or, if they had very good targeting, maybe at 40 miles.
How would they have known the ship was within range? It said this Neptune missile can go, I guess, about 190 miles. Mm-hmm. But how would they know that the ship, since it's out of visibility range, was within range of this weapon system?
Well, I think that what they probably did was they either had multiple electronic bearing lines from different ESM sensors along the coast. So like they, like if you think of it sort of like a triangulation, I drew like my little coastline here for you, Ken. But if they had a transmitter here, and here where the X's are,
yeah,
and the cruiser was maybe over here, they would be able to use bearing lines and kind of get a reasonable idea where that might be.
Good example.
So, but what you're doing though is like that, just like sort of like when you're tweaking that antenna, like as a kid for the UHF antenna, it's not perfect. So like, there's a certain amount of ambiguity. So it gives you like a rough area. So like they may have known like within like, I would say like a New Rochelle sized ellipse where the ship was probably. So one of the other things I think we talked about was, no kidding, there's a war going on right now. So it's highly unlikely that there would be other large targets that would be targetable by that weapon system. So like, cargo ships coming in and out of Odessa or something like that, probably not there, right? Because I think the Russians, if I'm not mistaken, are using their Navy right now as a blockading force. Sure. So in some ways, it self-selects out like what's there. Because the only things there are warships. So therefore, all contacts there are enemy from the Ukrainian perspective. And because the sea state was relatively high because of the weather, the missile systems actually use this thing called gain control. But like, if you remember like the old radios where you had like a squelch button to like get rid of the white noise, think of it in the same sort of way, as that because all that background scatter from the waves, the gain control actually goes up on the missile. So again, the only thing that missile can see are really large targets, such as the Salve class cruiser.
Sure. This was a Ukraine developed weapon, this Neptune missile?
Yeah, from what I've read, it's a derivative of an old Soviet era missile, the SSN-19 Switchblade. But it's modern. It's modern in that, like, solid state, microwave radar. So, but it's an indigenous product that's being made by, the Ukrainians. Okay. When in fact, I think you saw they attacked the factory this thing was built in.
How long would it take to go 60 miles out to where that ship was? How much time would the Russians have had to realize they were under attack?
Well, there's two pieces of that. One is the speed the missile's going at. So like typically anti-ship cruise missiles go about 0.9 Mach. But you can, if you just do like the time distance problem, it's 600 knots. Let's say it's 600 knots is about, 0.9 Mach just for our purposes here. Going 60 miles is 6 minutes. So very, very quick. But the thing is that those missiles tend to fly at about 50 feet above the deck.
Wow.
And so because they're so low, from a radar cross-section perspective, or they'll fly 50 feet above the waves, they've got like a radar altimeter, so they kind of know where they are. That weapon system, you don't see it until the last minute. And, if you have an air search radar, like the Salve does, you don't, it only looks at about every 15 seconds through its turn. So about 4 times a minute, the radar itself will spin. I don't believe they have a phased array like an Aegis ship would in the U.S. Navy. But the thing is that,
wow.
What's that?
That's a big difference.
Big difference. And I can't talk too much about that on, in the open here,
Okay,
but
that's okay.
it's okay. Yeah. I don't want to go to Leavenworth. We'll keep it unclassified. But the thing is that, one, you have to recognize the threat exists. So I think one of the things that, we think about here is that, was the Moskova even worried about getting shot at by a Neptune missile? Did they even think that the Ukrainians were, not so bold enough, but did they even have the capability to reach out and touch someone?
Wouldn't they have known about this Neptune system if the Ukrainians had developed it?
But that's probably why they were like, well, we'll just sit further off the coast, that sort of thing. The other thing is that don't forget, the Ukrainians have obviously shown that they have UAVs and other sorts of drone technology. There is a high likelihood that will maybe come out later is that it's not an ESM thing, like I said, but some drone, they were doing some sort of maritime patrol, if you will, for lack of a better term, and
so
saw
it could
this
have been fired by a drone.
No, it could have been located by a drone,
Located,
and then
okay,
that targeting data relayed back to the launcher on the beach.
Well,
so
you would think, commander of a U.S. Navy ship, offshore of a war zone, would have active defenses ready 24/7.
So that happened a few years ago off Yemen. I think that you might have known, there was an anti-ship cruise missile shot toward some U.S. Navy destroyers, and they took it out. But that, again, it goes back to what intel was the Moskova being given? What did they really believe the threat to be? And then what weapon systems are on board that Salve class cruiser that could actually possibly engage this thing. And so from just what I know about the Moskova, and I'm looking at a picture of it right now on my screen just to keep it straight here. They do have some air defense missiles. I am unsure if those missiles themselves would be capable of taking down anti-ship cruise missile, because most of these anti-ship cruise missiles do what they refer to as terminal maneuvers, and all of the Russian weapons are designed to attack Aegis, because Aegis is the best game in town. So if you can't take out Aegis, there's no point in playing. So you're asking a ship that's not even nearly as capable as an American Aegis destroyer to use a anti-ship air defense missile to take down these things. Not going to happen. So sort of the next layer is the close-in weapon system, which in the U.S. is the phalanx machine gun, or the phalanx system, or the rolling airframe missile is sort of a derivative of that. The Russians use a system called the AK-630, which looks like, if you're a Doctor Who fan, looks like a Dalek with a big 30 millimeter Gatling gun and 6 barrels. Really neat system. Work very similar to our CWIS system. That would have probably been their major opportunity to take these things down. And then usually when anti-ship cruise missiles show up, they don't show up just onesie twosies. They usually show up like a whole bunch of them, just to overwhelm the defenses of the ship. So, getting, I have a feeling that the Russians never expected this eventuality. In fact, I would argue that the reason that the Moskova was 60 miles at sea was they felt that was a safe enough place to be with that and not get targeted and not get hit. Because you're right, Ken. I mean, I think you brought up that, the Neptunes have about 120-mile range, but you have to know what you're shooting at. You can't just blindly shoot them out there and turn the radar on, because they'll go after whatever they think the next target is. I mean, it could be a cargo ship, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
And if you only have a limited number of those weapon systems, you want to be relatively accurate. So my guess is they had good enough targeting to hit the Moskova herself with high fidelity. They did that through, either, like I said, some sort of drone seeing it, or, something to get the targeting and then relaying that to the shooter and then getting the missile downrange. And then, 6 minutes of time for like the location for your missile launch show up. A modern warship sitting on patrol is probably only going about 5 knots or so, hanging out. So they're not going to move a whole lot from, where they were. They're not burning dinosaurs running fast at 30 knots. So, I mean, even though the Slava class cruiser can go 30 knots, that uses a ton of fuel. And, the Russians want to keep their ships on station. So, but I think the part that a lot of my friends have been really talking about isn't so much the ship getting attacked, because, that does happen. I mean, the Israeli ships got, an Israeli SAR-5 got attacked like it was 2006 by Hezbollah. They knew they had gotten some intel. In that case, like, they actually had intel that the Hezbollah had one of these Chinese-made Exocet knockoffs. They didn't take it seriously, did not have their weapon system turned on, took the hit. Now, the big difference, though, is that the Israelis actually were able to fight the fire, fight any of the flooding that occurred, and then that ship is now still sailing today as an Israeli warship. In this case, I keep hearing these stories about how the crew abandoned ship, and that's one of those ones, like, I having seen, and I'm postulating here, Ken, so I want to be respectful to the Russian Navy as best I can, but the showing that we're seeing with the front end Russian army forces, I would think, is somewhat indicative of maybe the training of the entire military system, including the Navy. I'll tell you, if it was a U.S. Navy ship and we were steaming in a condition like that, we would be in a wartime damage control setting already. The ship would be what they call a zebra, which is sort of like a maximum watertight integrity, like hatches closed. You're already segregating parts of the ship, in anticipation that you're going to get hit. And that's one thing from like the World War II experience. If you look at U.S. Navy ships, and if you've ever visited one, you can always see the pipes everywhere, and you can always see the valves. If you ever visit a European ship, most of those valves and things and pipes are actually behind false bulkheads to make it look nice. And part of that is because the U.S. Navy experience in World War II was our ships got hit, and then we had to do the damage control. So there was so our ships are actually designed, or I guess built with an expectation they're going to be attacked and they're going to be hit, and that the crew will do their best to keep the ship from going to the bottom, is the other thing too.
Yeah. Well, talking with Lieutenant Commander retired Brett Morash, PhD, and Brett, a little bit, what do you think the implications are? I mean, this is a major blow to the Russian military, their prestige. As you said, another indication of lack of preparedness, and it's going to affect their ability to support any landings they might have wanted to have done on the coast to take Odessa or the cities they're already attacking. What do you see the implication of the loss of this significant naval vessel in the Russian fleet?
Well, I mean, I think that, at the highest strategic level, I mean, you just had a ship named after the capital of your country taken down. I mean, in World War II, I mean, German Navy changed ship names so they didn't have like the Deutschland go down. Like, they changed the ship's name because they were so afraid that they were going to lose a ship named after the country. I mean, like, these are serious things, and that's why I always, when I see stuff like this, you're like, wow, man, like, that is a huge blow to national psyche. Obviously, the Russians internally are advertising that, there was a fire on board, the crew evacuated safely, the ship foundered while it was under tow. They're probably not telling their people it was attacked by Ukrainian missiles. They forgot that part of the storyboard, right? But I tend to believe that there was cascading effect on the ship side. I think that the other military units, the other naval units in the Russian Navy. If I was a sailor on one of those ships and I knew the pride of the fleet had just gone down, that's going to affect morale on those ships and maybe their combat effectiveness. I will tell you, I'm sure that those ships, tonight are in a much different condition right now, and they're thinking about being shot at. The problem is, as you brought up, Ken, is if they want to project power ashore. I mean, not only do they have to have the amphibious lift there, but they have to be able to get the combatant ships like the cruisers. And I'm sorry, I don't think they have any cruisers left anymore. And the
It was the only ship of that class in the area.
Well, but don't forget why, right? Because because of the Montrose Convention, right, which affects the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus Straits, only so many warships can be in there in the Black Sea at any one time. And so like the Russians' ability to even reconstitute that combat loss is zero, because the Turkish have already, and so like, again, I mean, we're talking about high strategy here. The Turks a few weeks back said that this is an ongoing war, no warships in, no warships out kind of thing. And so, even if the Russians wanted to send another Slavic class or a Krivov in to act as the flagship, not going to happen. So, they're obviously, they've lost combat power. You've got if you're going to do amphibious landing, that doesn't come with just the amphibious ships. You have to push combat ships up because they have to provide air defense cover with, anti-air missiles and the other things that those ships bring in place. But as the Ukrainians have just proven, they can reach out and touch you really quickly. So I think that, that will absolutely change the calculus there. I mean, I do think that the Russians will still be able to maintain a naval blockade because they'll just move their ships further out. It'll be harder. But I think it does have that effect, that we're talking about here.
Now, the NATO and the U.S. and the United States have been continuously supplying military equipment to the Ukrainians. There was a report of a 30-mile-long train going into Ukraine with supplies today. And the Ukrainians seem to be effective in utilizing the equipment they're receiving. How do you see that part working? They seem to have had some success, but the Russians seem to then go back to long-range artillery fire at the cities.
Long-range fires, yeah.
Impact.
Well, I mean, obviously, the quality and quantity of weapons going into the Ukraine from the West to support their military is going to be critical toward them blunting any Russian attack. And I think that what I saw today on the news, and I think I told you before, Ken, I teach adjunct at Norwich University. I teach strategy and policy there.
Sure.
So even my students, we kind of talk about this, is that the Russians have effectively retreated from around Kiev, and they've reconstitute what combat force they can in the Donbass region in the east. So that helps minimize their sort of logistical lines on the Russian side. But the facts of the matter is that this could very quickly degenerate into some sort of, like, I don't want to say trench warfare is not quite the word, but I think you're going to start seeing some sort of like fixed, sort of like where the lines in the sand are here. I mean, I think that the weather's getting better. It's not conducive to tank warfare because it's going to start becoming all slushy there. I mean, this is the same place that Operation Barbarossa occurred in, and the Nazis were slowed down in this area because of the weather.
Yeah.
The Russians are going to have the same problem if they want to project power. So I think that systems like the Javelin. I mean, people want to kind of refer to as a wonder weapon. It is an amazing weapon system. But a well-trained farmer can use that thing and wipe out a nearly $1 million tank. So I think that the weapon systems that I forget what the British ones are, but like the Switchblade, a whole bunch of those have been deployed. I think about 1,000 individual weapons. I don't know if you've seen those ones, Ken. They're basically a tube-launched, it looks like a PVC pipe, but and they call it the Switchblade because it's like a little drone that like pops out like a switchblade with the wings. Relatively small warhead designed for very tactical level units to do direct fires into like platoon size elements of people, or even tanks and other sorts of soft skin vehicles. So, that's a big deal. And I think one of the other things I think just been stunning to me is the number of very senior generals that have been killed on the battlefield. Either by sniper fire or well-placed munitions. It's showing that the Russians probably have their senior generals and colonels pretty close to the fighting, probably trying to motivate their troops. But when I say senior generals, I mean like there was a 3-star general killed. I mean like, during World War II, I think was it Leslie McNair and Simon Bolivar was the other general that was killed. So I mean, you have very, very few like 3-stars like were killed in the U.S. military during World War II. I mean, like stunning. And then now you look at what's going on here, and like the Russians are losing senior combat officers. So, and it's also the staffs that are around them, because like I think some people have been saying like doesn't matter, they got tons of generals and stuff like that. So that may be true, but it's the staff people that are around them that are getting killed as well. They're very hard to reconstitute those kind of senior level staffs. So it's pretty interesting.
Quoted today was President Putin saying that issuing several different types of threats against the United States and NATO allies about continuing to send the military weapons to Ukraine. How serious is that to be taken, do you think?
I'm sorry, could you say it again? I think I lost.
On the threats that have been reported from President Putin against the United States and the NATO allies about supplying these weapons to Ukraine, threatening retaliation. How serious do you think that is to be taken?
Well, I think look, it's a balancing act, right? And I'm not part of the administration, so I'm kind of quarterbacking this, okay, like on TV, because these are hard things, because I think professional military people would tell you like, these were the 10-foot tall giants that we planned against. Like, what is going on, right? So I think that you have professional military people that are at least going like, oh, well, maybe these guys aren't as big a deal as possible. However, you also have, the Russians are a nuclear armed, country with a lot of nuclear weapons. And I think that the fact that you saw, President Putin, even with all the diplomacy that had occurred prior to the invasion, still be like, yep, too bad, I'm going in there anyway. I think that, the senior decision makers have to really weigh that. And I think that is hard. I don't care who is in office, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, or, you're talking about what's going on if you're a NATO ally. I mean, these are tough things to deal with. I mean, I think you have to respect the threat. I think that's a given. I think people don't always want to, they'll say stuff like Putin's a madman. I don't believe that. I think Putin's operating on his own thought process, and we don't necessarily understand what that is. I think at the end of the day, it's all about regime survival. Just like in North Korea, it's all about regime survival. And as long as you understand that going in, I think it makes it a little clearer for you. I think that Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and that decision to make the bid to do that coming up, I think is a big deal. I think that will be more telling about what Russia's intent is if that were to occur. Russia isn't now, the biggest international pariah out there, even more than North Korea, right? I mean, who would have thought? So I know that's a non-answer, Ken. But these are
difficult question. Because the United States and NATO wants to continue to support Ukraine, and I don't think is going to step back from doing that. But something we've been talking about even on our WVOX show since the war started is how Russia would react to the U.S. and NATO supplying large amounts of armaments to Ukraine, enabling them to continue their fight. So I guess we're going to have to see.
Well, look, I mean, it's a proxy war, right? This is not the first time we've been a proxy war with the Soviets, Russians, right? But I mean, this is not the first time, right? So like, to a degree, this has happened before, like it happened in Vietnam, obviously, and, happened in Afghanistan on kind of both sides, depending on what years were going on. So like that's kind of par for the course here, if you will. I think a bigger question might be is that, what does happen when, a long range strike from Russia where they're trying to do something ends up landing inside of Poland and and a family of 4 gets killed in their house by mistake. Like what do we do then as a NATO ally? I think that's sort of the question you have to ask. And, I hope there's restraint, because I'm not sure we, need to go to war in Europe over Russia, and it's going to become a meat grinder. I mean, it's, that's the facts of the matter.
Do you see Russia at some point negotiating to get out of what the New York Times writers today described as a faltering war? They seem to be moving their forces to the eastern part of the country to try to perhaps to take regions there.
Yep. Well, look, I think that, if you're a student of Clausewitz, which is one of my all-time favorite, dead German generals to quote, right? But, he'll tell you that, going to war is politics by different means, right? And the goal is always to get back to the negotiating table. And I think that the calculus for the Russians prior to this was, we're going to force the Ukrainians to not join NATO, and we're going to do a regime change. That didn't happen, right? And so, now they have to be, like, okay, what do we really want to get out of this? Is it the Donbass region, annexing that as part of Russia, given that, frankly, the large amount of the population there probably do consider themselves Russian, right? Like, that's a part of the problem here, right? You're also talking about like the peoples that live there, what their national identity is, like as a nation, like that sort of thing. No easy answers here, or is it, they want to still take down Mariupol because they want that landline of logistics to the Crimea, right? Like that makes logistics a lot easier going into the Crimea, right? If you maintain that landline of communication that they didn't really have before. So like those are the sorts of things I think that you're probably starting to see that calculus. I think that what's gonna one of the things that a friend of mine and I were discussing the other day, he's a professor at Campbell University, he's a retired Navy officer as well, was that the Russian, April's the month that the new cohort of conscripts go into the Russian military. And it's so is watching the old cohort, do they demobilize them? Because one of the things that actually was, I think, really interesting here was that they keep talking about like it's a special operation. I think that you probably heard the Russians refer to it as special operation.
Yeah.
So, and sort of, I'm sure it's like translated Russian, like, so like it might not exactly say that if you're a Russian, like in your head, but like to us, it's that. Is that in order for the Russian military to actually mobilize the conscripts and the reservists, they actually have to be at war if they're going to use those troops outside of Russia. And so one of the things that my friend Frank was saying was that he's paying attention to what they do with the conscripts, because in order for them to like really take off the gloves, they really need to bring all the conscripts in. They need it to be like just a manpower thing, because how it's like, even with us in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's like winning the peace is the hard part, right? So like you can have your combat forces on the edge of Kiev, but you have to also garrison all of those lines back into Belarus, all of those lines back into Russia, right? So the same thing here, right? In order for them to really project combat power at this point, they might have to call up their reserves, they might have to call up their conscript forces, or they might have to uphold the ones going out.
And how much of that force is trained? There seems to be obviously.
Oh, no, training's, listen, I think compared to like what I think we've come to expect in the United States, horrendous would probably be the standard, I mean, but that's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, if you look at like Russian wars in the past, like a lot of them, they've won on sheer numbers, right? And, I think people were worried that the Russian military was 10 times the size of the Ukrainians. That is partially true. What they deployed into the Ukraine was actually the, I would say the elite forces, or what they considered elite, sort of like the projection forces. 90% of the Russian military has not been involved in this fight yet. But they haven't been able to leverage that 90% because there's not a declared war. And I think that's the part where people have to get, be watching for that. And I think some of the indicators will be, what they do with the next with the conscript class. So we'll see.
Well, it's interesting there that they do follow those kind of national guidelines. What do we've heard that the United States has obviously intensified the number of troops in Eastern Europe. Ports are about 5,000 members of the 82nd Airborne are in Poland. We've gotten messages from some friends in the military of the United States there. Do you see that the entire eastern border of NATO is going to now be a defendable zone for NATO to guard, really, from the north to the south, from the consequences of this conflict?
Yeah, well, it's not going to be like it was in the Cold War, right? At least right now. Like, we're not going to have the numbers of forces there. I think the forward deployment of the 82nd Airborne, which at the end of the day is light infantry, is more to show our resolve with our NATO allies that we are there with them and we're willing to put our troops in harm's way. And also, don't forget, like, the U.S. military is very much a mobile force. Like, so forward deploying and the lethality of our forces is great, especially in a as we showed during Gulf War I and Gulf War II. Like, the lethality of the U.S. military knows no peer, at least on the land side of things. I mean, it just doesn't. And so, us kind of flowing forces in to help back up our NATO allies, I think gives some peace of mind to them that we're willing to put our troops in harm's way. I think if the Russians did decide to go over a border, we would see the massive buildups required for that. You would see something similar, like the months and months of buildup prior to Ukraine in order for them to be able to do something like that. By that point, we would be flowing tanks and troops and all sorts of other stuff over, and we would be preparing for a much more massive response. So the 82nd Airborne, I mean, they're part of this thing called the RDF, which is the Rapid Deployment Force. It's approximately 15,000 troops that are on standby, ready to go anytime. Most of them happen to be in the airborne units because they're able to be moved quickly. So, like, typically you see the 82nd Airborne is usually the first one to go, or in Vicenza, Italy, is the 173rd Airborne Brigade is the other one. You'll occasionally see them push forward too in a similar role. So but you asked me, do I think the borders are defendable? I'm like, against what? Because, the Russians haven't built up that combat force to project yet anyway. So, sort of a Ken trick question here. So it's, there's a little chicken and egg here.
My dad was a World War II Army officer and then went back in 1950 and to Germany to serve for several years. And they said it was all about defending the border against another Russian invasion.
But the troops were built up, but that was different because the troops were forward deployed. The Russian troops were forward deployed. The Warsaw Pact nations, they were ready to go tomorrow. And so both sides of that border were in a wartime footing to a degree all the time, where now you've got sort of 20 plus, well, I don't know, when did the Berlin Wall fall? Like, almost 30 years ago, right? You've got 30 years of a malaise with our NATO allies who now are suddenly like, oh my gosh, we haven't paid attention to this. We've taken our foot off the gas. I mean, that was one thing I always felt with, like, the past administration is that, all of the administrations, whether Republican or Democrat, up until President Trump's time, were, would grumble about the NATO allies not doing what they said they were supposed to do for decades. And then you had President Trump come in, huge sea change, like, you guys got to get your act together. What are you doing? Or we're out of here. And, I didn't think they think it was serious, but, like, look what you got now. Like, you've got, if Putin's plan was to push the NATO allies closer together, check sat, like, good job. You did exactly that. I don't think that was his plan, but, I think that that's something that you have to really, kind of think through here, right? Is that, I think that the upside of this is our NATO allies will take their own defense much more seriously. I think the European Union, has for 20 years talked about creating their own EU military force, but most of that would be dual-hatted anyway with NATO. I think they might take that more seriously now themselves. I mean, these are the sort of things I think that are the high strategic outcomes of this, regardless. I mean, I just don't think the war is won or lost yet in Ukraine. I think it waits to be seen. I wouldn't be surprised if Russia is able to, let's say, capture the Donbass region and maintain it. That wouldn't surprise me if that, in a similar way that they did with, Crimea, where, most maps of the world, depending on who prints them, still shows as part of Ukraine, but occupied by Russia. I think we'll end up in a situation like that.
Yeah.
Is the most likely outcome. So,
well, maybe a final thought, and really appreciate a chance to talk with Brett Morash, a retired lieutenant commander of the United States Navy and also an instructor at Norwich University. Just in terms of the immense humanitarian toll this has taken on Ukraine, hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians killed. The artillery fire and missile attacks on cities have just been devastating.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, Russia is now a pariah internationally and is going to be, they're going to at some point want sanctions to be sanction relief. But are reparations to try to cover the cost of rebuilding Ukraine going to be part of a settlement?
I think that's tough. I mean, obviously the UN Security Council, is a just piece of that, and the Russians have a permanent seat and they have a permanent veto power. So I think that body will be somewhat stymied, period. And I think that trying to get some sort of reparations is going to be an uphill battle. I mean, I think that we could do stuff unilaterally as a nation, or, maybe some states, seizing assets of these, oligarchs and, kind of forcing it, but I think it's just going to be tough. I really do. I don't think it's a pretty bleak outcome, Ken. I mean, I'm going to be honest. I mean, I think more likely when things become, sort of like stabilization or peaceful again, as you see some sort of Marshall-like plan from the West to support Ukraine, to try to rebuild it as quickly as possible and help the refugees get back and things like that. I mean, I think that's a more likely outcome.
How about the impact of sanctions on Russia? United States is trying to seize banking assets. There is the Europeans are now talking about cutting off purchases of oil, which is funding Russia's military efforts largely. How about what do you see the long-term impact of these sanctions, and how long they're going to last, and how Russia would frankly be able to negotiate their ending?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, when it comes to anything like that, I mean, you've got the four instruments of power, right? When it comes to like the high strategy, it's diplomacy, information, military, and economic. The dime is sort of like we discuss it in strategy and policy. And right now, when it comes to military, like it's very clear that NATO is not going in there, right? Like that is very clear, like because we do not want World War III to break out. So we can only do so much militarily. Providing military weapons and stuff is about the kind of the max end of that. So leveraging the sanctions, I mean, that is the big lever here. And then from because the diplomacy side, Ken, right? I mean, like, look at the diplomacy side. It didn't work. UN Security Council is somewhat paralyzed because of who's on it, right? And the General Assembly, I think it was like, with the exception of like 5 members, including Russia and some of their buddies, for lack of a better term, unilaterally like condemn them. I mean, like that's almost unheard of, right? So I think that the economic sanctions are really the lever. I mean, like this is the stuff that we do. I mean, this is where you see like international. So like my specialty is like East Africa, like my PhD work, and a lot of what took down some of these terrorist organizations is the economic piece of that, and using all the power of economy to deal with that, because what's keeping the oligarchs in power is money. And and I think that frankly the sanctions haven't gone enough. I think you have to affect the average Russian with the sanctions. So the average Russian feels like, wait a second here, like the special operation, now I can't get vodka, now I can't get bread and potatoes and other sorts of things. Borscht, probably that's on the list of things that they probably want. But these are the things that, like, until you have that pain. I mean, you see that in Iran, right? And every once in a while, like, they ratchet up the sanctions, and then sort of like they have unrest at the sort of the like the people level. Yeah, and they worry about having a revolution, because guess what? In places like Russia and in places like Iran, it's not unheard of for the population to rise up and throw the guy out. So, and part of doing that, is leveraging the economic sanctions. And I think that is an incredibly important piece. And, but it's a slow motion. I don't know if you saw the movie Force 10 from Navarone, when they had like the explosion in the dam, and it took like 10 minutes for the dam to fall apart. This is the same thing. It's a slow motion explosion. You make these impacts and you got to wait it out.
Well, Brett Morash, so glad to have a chance to talk with you tonight and hear your thoughts on the sinking of this Russian cruiser named for the capital of Russia, and thoughts on the how this conflict is continuing and its trend. We really appreciate the chance to talk with you tonight.
No, thanks so much, Ken.
Thanks so much, Brett Morash, a retired Lieutenant Commander of the United States Navy and instructor at Norwich University, a PhD, and the Executive Director of Racing for Heroes and a colleague, show host on WVOX. Again, Brett, thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks, Ken.
And thanks, everyone, for watching. This is a special edition of SALRadio. Thanks for watching tonight. Have a good evening.